Hello. In the last episode, I talked about how stories are everywhere: Amazon, Audible, Netflix, and more. But not all stories are easy to find. Some have been ignored, some have been expunged, and some have been horribly distorted. That means a lot of stories have been hidden away. I'm Scott Blevins, and that's what I'm talking about today. In the last episode, I shared some of the reasons why I and maybe others love stories. They offer courage, inspiration, escape, and other things. They have the power to shape lives, families, cultures, nations, ethnic groups, and genders. But this power cuts both ways, because stories also have the power to misshape all of those things, to distort all of those things. This kind of missshaping and distortion when it comes to stories can happen in a lot of different ways, but I'm going to highlight three important ways today. One, this missshaping can happen when stories intentionally distort reality. They intentionally change reality, change history, change the facts so that certain groups and people, nations, and individuals might look better than they really were or might look worse than they really were, and usually it's a combination of both. Some stories can be ignored. When stories are ignored, reality is distorted. Expunged stories. Some stories seem to be so dangerous to the people and the groups that are in power that they need to expunge those stories completely. You can see evidence of that in the story of the history of the United States of America and many other countries as well. You can also see that in the stories of the history of our church, the Christian faith. All three things distort reality. All three things lead to misshapen identities. And all of these can be summed up with the truism that winners write the history. In other words, the dominant culture has the power to distort reality, ignore some stories, and attempt to expunge other stories in a way that will serve the cultural goals of that dominant culture. The sad truth is that's been part of my reality, part of my experience. And I wasn't even really aware of that until not too many years ago. I grew up in a wonderful home environment. I grew up in an amazing family with amazing parents, and my brother and sister and I didn't always get along, but we had a good relationship overall, and we still do. I had a great upbringing. The truth is my view of reality was distorted within that upbringing because the stories I told, some of them were distorted stories, and there were stories that were hidden from me and stories that were expunged from the record so that I couldn't have found them even if I'd been looking at that time. I grew up believing in American exceptionalism. It wasn't taught that way when I was a kid. At least I had never heard that term, not until the past few years. But I was taught that the worst day in the United States is better than the best day in any other country. I was taught that America had been more of a blessing to the people of this earth than any other country in the history of the world, with the possible exception of the nation of Israel, who did in fact give us the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. I was taught that the great stories of the United States were the great stories of humankind, that our founding fathers were not just national heroes, but global heroes, people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, people later in our history like Abraham Lincoln or Teddy Roosevelt or Dwight Eisenhower, people that had accomplished great things and done great things and helped build this nation into the greatest nation in the history of the world. These were the stories that I was taught. I was taught that our country was a Christian country, a Christian nation, that we had a manifest destiny to occupy North America from coast to coast, that Christians fleeing religious persecution in Europe came to the United States, came to the colonies to establish a new Christian nation that was heir to the promises of the nation of Israel in the Old Testament, that we were the new covenant community. These were the stories I was taught. These shaped my understanding of the country that I live in, the world that I live in, the culture that I occupy. They shaped my personal understanding. I was an heir to these promises. I was an heir to these stories. Had the responsibility for continuing these stories. They formed a large part of who I was, who I thought about, how I thought about myself, how I thought about my family, how I thought about my church, my country, my faith, all of these things. And then a few years ago, I learned some new stories. Some of those stories that had been distorted, some that had been hidden, some that there had been attempts to expunge. I read 2 books that had an amazing impact on my life. One was a book called One Church, Many Tribes by Richard Twiss, a Native American who also happened to be a Christian and a pastor. And the book Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by D. Brown. And I learned in those stories that the stories I heard about the cowboys and the Indians were distorted stories. That the cowboys were not always, maybe even not often, great heroes, just maybe ordinary folks that did some ordinary things, but also some extraordinarily evil things. The same was true of American soldiers, including Union soldiers. The same was true of American politicians and presidents, including some that I had been told were the greatest in history. I learned that the people indigenous to this continent, Native Americans and First Nations people who had genocide attempted upon them by people who looked like me. I learned those stories, some of them, and I began to see how my view of reality had been distorted. I also began intentionally listening to the stories of African Americans, contemporary people, folks that I knew, people that I was meeting, and I heard their stories. And I learned that even though I was told that slavery had been an awful thing, that had been solved with the Civil War, and the problem of racism wasn't completely solved. Yes, there was Jim Crow, but all of that was fixed by the civil rights legislation, and all those problems had really been solved, and everything was really okay in that regard, until I started hearing stories I'd never heard before, of people my age who'd experienced horrible racism, who'd experienced horrible Jim Crow continuing in many different ways, until I began to see the effects of legislation like the 13th Amendment, which permits slavery to continue. I began to hear different stories. And these new stories didn't just touch my thinking. They touched the core of my identity, because they touched and threatened the core stories that had shaped how I thought about myself and my family and my faith and my church and my country and my world. Stories have the power to shape. Stories have the power to misshape. And what gets distorted? When we have stories that misshape, when we have distorted stories, or we hide stories or expunge stories, what gets distorted? Personal identity gets distorted. Corporate identity gets distorted. National identity gets distorted. Global identity gets distorted. Ethnic identity gets distorted. Gender identity gets distorted. And it leads to false identities, hidden identities, stolen identities in these areas. Think of the story, the true story, Hidden Figures, the amazing mathematicians, Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, and others, African-American women who played such a vital role in the early days of the U.S. space program. I never told those stories? Why didn't I ever look for those stories when I got old enough to look for myself? When those stories get hidden, and we have a national narrative, and this is a story I was told. I got to tell you, I don't even remember who told it to me. I don't know whether I heard it at school. I don't know whether I read it somewhere in a magazine or a book. I don't know where I first heard it. But early on, I was told that story that science had shown that white-skinned people, Caucasians, had natural giftedness toward intellect, and dark-skinned people, African Americans, had natural giftedness toward athletic ability. That's why there are so many successful black athletes, but why scientists and mathematicians tend to be white. See how that distorts reality? And when we only tell the stories, why is it that of all the people I had ever heard about notable in the U.S. space program, they were all white and they were all men. That kind of storytelling distorts reality, and it hides identities and it steals identities. It leads women and African Americans, as they're hearing those stories, to not even imagine themselves as fitting into those stories, as having a place in those stories. They can't see themselves sometimes with that possibility of having the identity of successful scientist, successful mathematician, national leader in the United States. Why? Because the stories we've been told were distorted, identities hidden, identities expunged. This is what happens with distorted stories, with misshapen identities. Let me pull it back a little bit from something that might feel a little less imminent and personally threatening and take it back 2,000 years or so and look at the history of the Christian faith. The early stories that I was told were all about men. We're all about men. I learned about in seminary the Desert Fathers. And I had a book. It's a book I've had for years. I love it. It's the Sayings of the Desert Fathers. And at that time, I also heard about the Desert Mothers. But I was told most of their stories had been destroyed. And in fact, they had. At some point along the way, the church literally decided, that it was too dangerous to have a collection of the sayings of the Desert Mothers. And an intentional effort was made to destroy all copies of any sayings of the Desert Mothers. Not all of them were destroyed. This was an attempt at expunging stories that was not completely successful. There were some that were saved. I recently discovered a book by Laura Swan called The Forgotten Desert Mothers. In it, she writes these words: "Women's history has been relegated to the shadow world, felt but not seen. Many of our church fathers became prominent because of women. Many of these fathers were educated and supported by strong women. And some are even credited with founding movements that were actually begun by the women in their lives. Early church histories frequently make brief mention of women dwelling in the desert, living as urban solitaries, or residing in or near monastic communities. Palladius, in his Lausaic history, estimated that the women outnumbered the men by 2 to 1. Yet it is the stories of the men that are preserved and told. Both men and women were involved in evangelization and works of mercy to the poor, orphans, and prisoners. Women held leadership positions. Ancient tombstones reveal a history of women bearing titles such as ruler of the synagogue, deacon, presbyter, and honorable woman bishop. Yet there were struggles in these attempts at integration. Women and slaves shared in the work of evangelization and discipleship and the building of faith communities, and some of these faith communities were culturally Jewish, others Greek or Roman, while some emphasized the prophetic gifts. In the 4th century, though, Christianity gained acceptance and became the official religion of the Roman Empire. With this transition, leadership within the church movement became increasingly public. Social mores required that women remain in the home and out of the public sphere. So despite Galatians 3:28, pressure began to build for women to be removed from public leadership in conformity with custom. Women were written out of church history. Their sayings were deemed not only unimportant, but dangerous. They were ignored, they were hidden, and they distort the reality of Christianity and the Christian faith, suggesting that women have been unimportant, or at least not nearly as important as men, when quite the opposite is true. Hidden stories, expunged stories, distorted stories. They don't just distort stories, they distort identities. They distort realities at every level. What do we do about it? What can we do about it? Well, there's a couple things we can do about it. We can recognize the reality that forces are competing to shape personal, cultural, national, ethnic, and gender identity. And these forces have many different motives, most of which are self-serving, well, in the sense of serving the interests of the power brokers and influencers who tell the stories. We recognize that competition. We can step back. We can be intentional. We can listen with a critical ear to all the stories, or at least to a broader range of stories that are out there. That's the other thing we can do is we're going to be intentional. We need to be intentional about the stories we're listening to and how we listen to them. I invite you to listen for stories and listen to stories outside of the mainstream of the dominant culture you happen to be in. So if you're part of Western culture, look for stories outside the mainstream of the dominant culture that you're in. Listen with a critical and questioning ear. I recently heard a podcast from the Holy Post podcast, which I highly recommend. You can find a link down below the video here on YouTube. And they were interviewing a woman named Caitlin Chess, who is the author of The Liturgy of Politics. And she suggested that we ask ourselves questions as we hear these stories. She was talking primarily about political stories, but I think this is true of all stories. First of all, ask yourself, what good life is this story describing? Second, ask yourself, what is it telling me I need to do to get that good life? Third, ask yourself, who or what is this story asking me to love? Fourth, who or what is this story asking me to fear or hate? And fifth, does this story line up with the story that Scripture tells me? Asking those questions and listening to stories outside of the dominant culture in which you're in can give a reality check. Listen to those news stories, whether it's books, TVs, movies, or personal conversations with folks that come from a different cultural or ethnic background to you, and then be willing to revise your core stories in light of a new truth, even when it hurts. I got to tell you, when I began reading Richard Twiss, when I began reading Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, when I began really listening to African American sisters and brothers and their stories, it hurt. And please don't hear that as me saying feel sorry for Scott because it hurt him to realize these. That's not what I'm saying. I'm simply describing reality because we have to be willing to experience the pain and recognize that there is pain in this process, in this experience. There are two problems, again, in our culture with that. One is we like happy ending stories. We don't want to deal with stories that cause pain unless we know that there's a real nice happy ending coming real soon. And the second is that if we're entering into stories primarily as a means of escape, then we probably are trying to avoid pain rather than willingly finding pain and even embracing pain as we change and rewrite and allow our identity to be rewritten. I can tell you, when I was growing up, I could tell you that I was I was Republican, I was conservative, I was a capitalist, I was a United Methodist, in my mindset and my activity. I could tell you all of these things. I was confident in my identity. I knew who I was. As I hear more and more of these stories, I don't know what I am. I don't know, I don't know if I'm Republican, if I'm Democrat, if I'm third party, if I'm independent. I don't know whether I'm liberal or conservative. I don't know whether I'm a capitalist, socialist, communist. It's not like that critiquing one story means automatically you jump easily into another one. My identity is messed up right now. And I think that's a good thing. It's a painful thing. Again, I'm not asking for pity. I'm just describing reality. It's a painful thing to say my identity's messed up. It's a painful place to be, but it strikes me that that's a good place to be because if I recognize that my identity is messed up, then now maybe God can build his identity in me. Which brings us to the other thing we need to do with this reality check. We need to let the Bible question our stories. We got to be careful even when we do that, though, because how we understand the Bible is guided by our culture. And too often in Western culture, the story of the Bible is controlled and used by our culture rather than the Bible guiding, shaping, and critiquing our culture. So if you want to let the Bible, I think one of the great ways to let the Bible shape your story and help you evaluate the stories you're listening to is to find authors and artists and friends outside of Western culture to help you shape your understanding of the Bible and its narrative. If all this sounds like a lot of hard work, it is, but it's worth it. You are what's at stake here. The core of who you are, your identity, your soul, that's what's at stake, but not just yours, but also of your families, your children, your community and your nation, the people that make up the community and the nation, this world and its people. It's a lot of work. But think of it like a story, like a quest. I said in the first episode, I'm on a never-ending quest for good stories. I'm not talking about happy ending stories, and I'm not even talking about feel-good stories. I'm talking about stories that will shape me and my culture to be more like the kingdom that Jesus described, a kingdom that's free of pride and selfishness and egotism, free of all of the isms, racism and sexism and genderism, free of bloated, self-serving desires, free of exploitation and domination. It's a kingdom where love is the ethic and peace is the atmosphere, a kingdom where people of every tongue, tribe, and nation live in a harmony composed by God. That's the story I want to live in. That's the story I want to live out of. And I got to tell you, I think whatever pain it costs to live into and out of that story has got to be worth it. So thank you for watching today. Whether you leave it in the comments or email me at scott@garfieldchurch.org, let me know what you think and let me know what stories are shaping you. I really want to hear that. In the next episode, we jump into scary stories. It is October after all. Until then, don't be afraid to tell your story and don't be afraid to listen to the stories of others.